to this CERC seminar. Let me just mention that we have another one coming up next week. That's Professor Jalai Tihanki from De La Salle University in the Philippines, talking about constitutional change, which he should know about because he was a member of the Constitutional Commission there, which has drawn up a draft constitution. So all welcome, same time next week, Monday at 4 p.m. Professor Tihanki. But today, we're very pleased to have Dr. Bonwego, who's a postdoctoral researcher from Finland, and here comes the really embarrassing part. He tried to teach me the name of his university, but he's from the University of...
Jyväskylä.
Everybody get that? Yeah. We have a Finn in the audience, so I might point out. So how is this pronunciation, okay? We're very much, we're very pleased that Dr. Wego is here today, also because he is a CERC fellow. And it's, I have to say, through his interest in this center, his perseverance with some of the bureaucracy one has to deal with here in Hong Kong, that he's here. And we're very pleased indeed. He's been very active already in the department and various events going on around the center. So we're very grateful already, Juan, even before you give your talk here, for what you've done and also for your efforts to come and join us. So he is currently a postdoctoral researcher in Finland. He is interdisciplinary in his teaching in terms of social, political, and economic sciences, but his main focus is development. He's a visiting fellow here, as I said, and previously he was a guest researcher at the Department of Political Science at Aalborg University and the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, quite a famous institute for the study of this region at the University of Copenhagen. Recent publications of research on the contemporary Philippines and Malaysia, so a comparativist by nature, looking at the political economy of ASEAN, the Economic Community Project, the challenge of right-wing populism and nationalism Asia, as well as political economy issues such as the new privatization of global development finance. And this talk that he's given today is based on two publications he has, and as we've discussed in our own conversations, it's been very interesting. Of course, things in the Philippines have been moving quite quickly over the past 2 years since the election of Rodrigo Duterte, but just in May in Malaysia, all of a sudden, something quite spectacular happened there with the defeat of the long-serving UMNO party for 60 years in power, and now they've been replaced. So these are exciting times in Southeast Asia, and we're very pleased that you're here and also to give us this comparative analysis of these two countries. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for coming. I think I'll just sit down. In the past 2 years, there are two political phenomena and personalities that have, from Southeast Asia, that have hit the global headlines. And that are the rise of Duterte and the return of Mahathir. Well, the third one would be the issue with regard to Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. Okay. My presentation today, or our discussion, will be based on two of my recent publications. The one is on entitled the Duterte-led authoritarian populism and its liberal democratic roots. And then the second one is on the institutions of authoritarian neoliberalism, a comprehensive review of the development agendas of the regimes of Mahathir, Abdullah, and Najib. Since I only have like 40 minutes and I'm presenting two papers, what I would like to do here is just to highlight my main points and my main arguments, the key findings, and to talk more about concepts, policies, and phenomena. I won't deal much into personalities and then the details because not all of you are really Philippine or Malaysia experts. Okay. So, on the first paper on the rise of Duterte, I had two objectives there. The first was to provide a conceptual framework on how do you understand the populist trend happening in the Philippines. And my second objective for that paper was to make the argument that the so-called EDSA-type liberal democracy has been a spawning ground for the increasing popularity of Duterte. Okay. So in the first instance, I was arguing how and why anti-democratic politics get popular legitimacy. And then in conceptualizing authoritarian populism, let me be very clear about how I use the concept. Okay, I see authoritarian populism as an emergent socio-political process. I don't mean it as a coherent ideology or a state form or a governance platform. My focus is on the history and the tendencies of the current socio-political conjuncture. Okay. Authoritarian populism is a self-contradictory process in the sense that the legitimacy of undemocratic or anti-democratic politics of Duterte are derived from the support of the perceived majority of the population. Yeah. But this contradiction is a source of both strength and weakness of the Duterte regime. Its strength because of its catch-all politics, it has the effect of divide and rule. Okay? Weakness in the sense that that contradictory phenomenon has policy incoherence, and it also promotes regressive politics. Okay. But how do we analyze authoritarian populism? So I come up with multifaceted dimensions of the phenomenon, and I found 12. Actually, in the article, I only highlighted 11 of that, and I'm adding the 12th one today. So all this multifaceted dimension of populism constitute the building blocks in our analytical framework. So we have to understand first the peculiarity of the movement's victory and popularity. Second, the personality of the movement's leader and figurehead. The third was the position of that kind of populism in the left-right political spectrum. The fourth, it has its own language in discourse. Fifth, it is a rhetoric, which is basically a critique of established ideology. Sixth, it uses social media, and that use of social media impacts on socio-political relations. The seventh, in terms of class dynamics and support base, we have to understand it. And the eighth dimension would be the strategy of the movement in securing political and social hegemony. The sixth, what is the movement's or Duterte's governance approach? And the 10th would be what is the regime's socioeconomic policy and in terms of political economy. 11 would be in foreign policy, and then the 12 would be political philosophy. Okay, I'll just be quick on this. Hopefully, okay. So why did Duterte win, and why does he remain popular? There are several reasons on that, but for me, three stand out. The first would be agential. Duterte's team came up with a better campaign strategy compared with his rivals. Okay. The third would be an institutional factor. The Philippines has a plurality voting system, so Duterte got the most number of votes, he became president. If we had like a runoff election, or if it were a parliamentary setup, the political fate or fortune of Duterte may have been different. So I think the institution is a key factor there. The third would be structural. It was a protest vote against the hypocrisy and shortcomings of the 30-year liberal democratic regime. The second dimension, so how do we characterize the personality of the leader? If the kind of populism that Duterte has is organized around a cult of personality, around a charismatic leader. It's different from the European cases where a lot of this populist movement would be centered on political parties. Okay, but since we do politics and not just sociology, we understand the reasoning behind charisma. Charisma is an important factor in the Philippines because of the kind of political system that we have. Very personalistic oriented. Okay. And the third dimension would be on the position of that kind of populism. So there are two types of populism, right-wing or left-wing populism. Duterte espoused, especially in the beginning, a mix of both left-wing and right-wing populism. Okay? So he was a self-proclaimed socialist and leftist, even though he did not have a coherent socialist program, or he does not belong to any socialist party. But then, as you know from the news, he has drastically shifted towards the right. Yeah. So I think that's also one of the differences of Duterte. Now we see, like in Brazil with Bolsonaro, he was just like anti-left, through and through. But Duterte somehow tried to reach out to the left and even claimed that he's part of the left. Okay. The fourth is on the construction of a populist language, or what I call the Duterte speak. So he was able to connect well with the lived experiences and real life concerns and legitimate fears and sentiments of the Filipino people. Okay, and that also includes the public articulation of politically incorrect statements. But those statements, which we consider politically incorrect, are what I consider dominant discourses that are ingrained deep in the psyche of most people, like machismo, sexism, violence, the need to discipline the citizenry, the need for order. Those are, if you talk to ordinary Filipinos, they are there, they just don't mention that publicly. But Duterte was able to voice that out. So those have been part of the dominant discourse in the Filipino mentality and culture. And then Duterte's populism was also a discursive critique against both the theory and praxis of liberal democracy. Okay. But the strength of his argument lies on his critique of the practice of liberal democracy, a critique against the hypocrisies of the liberal elites. That's how he gained so much popularity. And then on the sixth dimension, Duterte has also effectively mobilized the social media. It has proven to be a convenient tool for popularizing populist sentiments and arguments. And it created what I call the populist moment. This populist moment is in line with what sociopolitical psychologists call groupthink behavior, tribalistic mindset. We the good citizens versus them, the evil enemies, like that kind of groupthink behavior. And the argumentation is just based on confirmation biases, a lot of logical fallacies, basically straw man arguments and ad hominem. The seventh dimension has to do with the support base. Okay, in the beginning, what is distinctive about Duterte was that is a populism that cuts across classes, gender, generations, and the political spectrum. So it was a catch-all politics. It was able to create a big tent coalition. But after a year and 2 years, we see Duterte shifting more to the center-right, and that includes his support base and governance style. Okay. The eighth dimension would be on the strategy of the Duterte's followers. Okay, but it's not just based on the usual harassment and silencing of critics and opposition. Key would be the proactive mass mobilization strategies. Social media play a key role in that. Okay. And the other one would be the creative use of the legal system to discipline the opposition in dissent, so that when Duterte would propose something or attack an opposition, he would say it's in the name of the rule of law, in the name of justice, or even in the name of nationalism or national interest. Okay? So it's not just based on the usual coercion and silencing. Okay? The ninth dimension, how do you characterize the governance approach of Duterte? I call it police-centric, and militaristic. So the much publicized would be the drug war. And the illegal drugs issue is, we can say it's a microcosm of the Philippine society, because it embodies the socio-economic problems of the Philippine society. And what's the approach of Duterte there? It's just police-centric. Just use the police. So it reminds us of what we call in policy studies on the law of instruments. If you only have a hammer as a tool, all your problems would look like nails. Okay, so in the case of Duterte, if your only tool is the police, also all the socio-economic problems look like police problems. So in effect, he was criminalizing poverty, school dropouts, the negative social consequences of economic migration. So it's just like criminalizing all these legitimate socioeconomic problems. And then the second would be a militaristic approach to deep social and historical conflicts, like the issue with insurgency with the communist armed group. Okay, and then that was highlighted in two events, like in the Marawi crisis. He declared martial law. Until now, Mindanao is martial law, so that basically puts a third of the country under military rule. The second one was the tagging of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the National Democratic Front, and New People's Army as terrorist organization. It's a very militaristic approach, and we know in the social sciences that addressing insurgency and communism would require much more comprehensive approaches, deep-seated economic and social reforms. Okay. And then what I see in his style also is that it misses a class perspective. Okay. So, like in the drug war, for instance, he would blame the individual drug addicts. If he were a socialist, the socialist approach would be to be indignant at the social and economic and the historical reasons that allow individuals to be victimized by drug addiction and to be victimized by crime. So there's some sense of methodological individualism in this kind of approach. Okay. 11, 10, dimension on socioeconomic policy and political economy. So he introduced the Duterte dynamics. The way I read the Duterte dynamics is that it is an authoritarian neoliberalism. Okay. It's not yet that model, but the logic of it is like authoritarian neoliberalism. By it, I mean that he is economically neoliberal, but he would like to embed free market capitalism in an authoritative, repressive state institution. So that's how I see authoritarian neoliberalism. But in the past 2 years, we've also been seeing a tension between the economic neoliberals among the economic team of Duterte in his cabinet and his populist economic promises, like free public education, especially at the university level, increasing the salary and wages of the police, the military, and government workers. His economic team, the neoliberals, don't like those populist policies. So I cannot conclude yet, but so far I see the tension between these two tendencies. Okay. The 11th on the dimension foreign policy, there are three phenomena and concept that I see in there. One would be a shift from idealistic nationalism, especially what he was doing during the election, to pragmatic realism or pragmatic economic cooperation. You see that in the way he deals with China. In the beginning, he would have this nationalistic statements, like he would plant the Philippine flag on the territorial on the disputed territories in the South China Sea. So that's very nationalistic. But in the past 2 years, you see him being much friendlier towards China. So he became much more pragmatic in that regard. And then the other phenomenon I see would be authoritarian peace. You know, he's very friendly with fellow authoritarians, particularly in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is a peaceful coexistence among authoritarians. And the third, what I see, why he is very friendly right now with Donald Trump is what I call the populist peace. You know, a peaceful coexistence amongst populists. Okay. So the 12th and last dimension, which was not in the article, but which I've been blogging about, is on the dimension of political philosophy. What I see would be the regime of exception, okay, or the state of exception. Duterte and even his legal team, they are not interested in law. You know, they are interested in management. They are not even interested in the prevention of conflicts and crises. Somehow you get a sense that he would like conflict and crisis to happen so that he could intervene. Recently, he was even daring the senator who was known to launch a coup d'etat, Trillanes in the beginning, to bring it on. You know, so I think. Even though Duterte has not solidified the military behind him, he has already made some calculation that he has factions within the military that if Trillanes' faction would move, they would still win in the end. So this kind of, it's what we call biopolitics or the state of exception. That kind of political philosophy has been missing in a lot of discussion about populism. And I have noticed that there is missing sense on political philosophy also in discussing even social movement politics, you know. But I can go back on that point later on. Okay. So those are like the 12 dimensions that I see in Duterte's populist regime. Okay. So, and And yeah, we have to blame the Marcos dictatorship for all the problems, actually for all the major problems that the Philippines have had. But we should also not forget the the scenes of the what we call the EDSA Republic that has replaced the Marcos dictatorship. You know, the EDSA regime came to power through the People Power Revolution in 1986. So, and it introduced a constitution that is supposed to embody the ideals of liberal democracy. Okay? So I'm not really saying that the Philippines was a liberal democratic regime. It has the trappings of liberal democracy. So, and why Duterte remains popular is because of the bad record also of the EDSA Republic. One would be the recurring themes of elitism, impunity, and corruption in the Philippines. Okay, why the Marcos family's experiment or agenda for historical revisionism is very much alive, is because the EDSA Republic has failed. But the Marcos family cannot boast of its own achievements and merits. Yeah, let alone if you compare it with his contemporaries in East and Southeast Asia. So Duterte's popularity banked on the failure of the EDSA liberal democratic regime. The second is that the EDSA Republic also does not have a good record on human rights, on press freedom and extrajudicial killings. But, so Duterte is attacking the institutions of human rights. And over the long term, he becomes even more dangerous if you think that Duterte is not only attacking the institutions, but also the very ideas of human rights. Yeah? So it has both institutional and ideational attack on human rights. The third is that the EDSA Republic also has the myth of separation of powers, when in fact the EDSA Republic is just based on executive dominance. Professor Mark Thompson has written extensively on that, on hyper-presidentialism. So what we see in the Duterte regime right now is that his authoritarianism is being built on the very institutions of a democratic republic. And the fourth feature of the EDSA Republic is that that it has shown how an incumbent government can pursue selective justice and political cleansing. Okay, so it's nothing new in Duterte, but Duterte has introduced, as I mentioned, all these creative legal acrobatics, the quo warranto to remove the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and then there's another one on the revocation of the amnesty. So those are creative legalism that are destructive to democracy. But it's nothing new. The EDSA Republic has also shown those kinds of strategy. And then in the EDSA Republic, you also see a vicious pattern in political and governance coalition. So in the beginning, what we see in every administration would be the so-called liberal phase. Yeah, so it's just like forming a coalition, and later on it would move to a repressive phase. You know, every administration would have, for instance, an ally coming from the left. Yeah, but the difference in Duterte was that Duterte tried to ally with the most radical, the armed group of the left. Okay, so from Cory to Ramos to to Estrada, to Pinoy, you see in the beginning there was a liberal phase and then moving to more repressive phases. Okay. And the sixth feature in the EDSA Republic was that that liberal democracy was also closely bounded with neoliberalism and US colonialism that destroyed the manufacturing potential, perspective for industrialization of the Philippines. And so Duterte's populism is actually a valid critique against the crisis and failings of neoliberalism and US colonialism. The seventh feature of the EDSA Republic was that while we have attained much political civil freedoms, the EDSA Republic failed on bringing about socioeconomic equality and a sense of human solidarity among the Filipinos. So it's just like in the French Revolution motto, you have so much emphasis on the liberty, but we have forgotten the question of equality and human solidarity. And the revolution has also failed because the plutocratic system has been intact. Why, for instance, the Marcoses are still powerful? It's because they have remained wealthy. And as we know in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian political economy, economic wealth can easily regenerate into political power. Yeah. And then, yeah, that kind of system created a highly insecure population. So that's how I see the Duterte-led authoritarian populism. It's a system. It's a symptom as well as a response to the crisis of the EDSA liberal democratic regime. Now I'll move to the second paper on Malaysia. Okay. So the starting point of that argument was so there was a historic election in May 9 in this year. Mahathir came back to power, okay. And that coalition promised reform, particularly regime change. So I asked the question, what are the institutions that must be changed, that must be reformed? And the way I study Malaysian development trajectory and political economy, what I see there is the regime of what I call authoritarian neoliberalism. Yeah. Basically, a regime whereby a neoliberal economy is embedded in an authoritarian polity. So this is what I've done. I read all the development plans in Malaysia from the actually not just from the 1990s, even since the 1980s. Okay. So in Malaysia, there have been 3 regimes already in the past how many years? 30, 40 years. Okay. So Mahathir came to power, so he was there for 22 years. Abdullah was in power for 6 years, and then Najib for 9 years. So each and every administration came up with development catchphrases or development slogan. Mahathir calls it Wawasan 2020 or Vision 2020. Abdullah calls it Islam Hadari, and Najib calls it One Malaysia. So, upon reading all these documents, I've noticed 2 persistent logic in these development plans. The first was the ruling elite's constant requirement for political stability enforced by a strong state. Okay, we all know that, that's authoritarianism. The second was the need to adapt to the demands and opportunities of accumulation in specific phases of Malaysia's capital's development in the context of globalization. So that's what I call the neoliberalization process. And this is the kind of argument that I differ from the others, like my post-Keynesian friends, yeah, because they always question me about my characterization of Malaysia as neoliberal. Yeah. But my emphasis here is on the process, neoliberalization. Yeah, so it has different tendencies and trajectory. Okay. So the authoritarianism is easily understandable, but I would like to focus more on the neoliberalization. Okay. So the national development strategy of Mahathir is what I call Mahathir-style neoliberalization with industrialization. Okay. When I did the comparative study with the Philippines, I call the Philippine neoliberalization as a neoliberalization without industrialization, and that makes a lot of difference. Okay. So when Mahathir introduced Wawasan 2020, that was the period of the crisis of Keynesian developmental state. But at the same time, it was also the emergence of the first generation neoliberal offensive. Okay. So Mahathir basically did that privatization, liberalization, but he's much more calculating. Yeah. So it's not, so Mahathir pursued neoliberal policy, but not in accordance with the template of the Washington Consensus. Okay. And then in 2003, when Mahathir stepped down, Abdullah introduced Islam al-Hadhari. That is a project to have a progressive or moderate Islam. Okay. The agenda was to have a capitalism with Islamic characteristic. That was the phase of neoliberalism, what we call the post-Washington Consensus, where we also heard lots of discourse about social capital and human capital. So basically, it moved away from a rather limited macroeconomic policies during the Washington Consensus on privatization, liberalization, deregulation, to a more comprehensive development agenda. And they tried to include now the role of non-market institutions in pursuing capitalist development. Okay. Actually, Paul Kamek is very strong in this kind of framework. Okay. So Abdullah tried to introduce that Islam Hadhari in the context of two crises in the geopolitical economy. One was the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks, and then before that was the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Okay. The third, now after Abdullah resigned, so Najib introduced his One Malaysia program. Okay. So the framework at that time in global development discourse was towards global competitiveness. Okay. And the context of introducing that during 2008 and 2009 was the Atlantic crisis, and also the rise of China, and then the 2014 oil and commodity price decline. So the point here was that Malaysian development strategy adjusts to the discernible shifts in the different phases of neoliberalism and the global development discourse. And these are also national development strategies to address the crisis in in capitalism during these distinctive periods. So as I mentioned, Mahathir was in 2020. I call it the economic heterodoxy. Heterodoxy. Yeah. And then I highlighted there in his speeches about his anti-democracy, both in his speeches and his action. Okay. In Abdullah, I read in his speeches and then in the news reports and his programs, development plans. I call it the capitalism within the Islamic characteristics. But then he also failed in all his promises for political reforms, including his own family was embroiled in controversies and issues of corruption. And then Najib, the recent or the previous Prime Minister of Malaysia. So in the article, what I did was to expose the doublespeak on democracy in his speeches. Yeah. But he would talk about democracy, but then when you look at his security laws, yeah, you would see all the contradictions in there. Okay. And Najib pursued all this global competitiveness. So in response to crisis, he went to large-scale mega projects. And a key strategy there was on his China policy. So it was a conscious effort to integrate Chinese capital into Malaysian accumulation regime. So he signed a lot of agreements that Mahathir right now is taking a hard stance against. Okay. And on the idea of authoritarian liberalism, I recently published this article on the ideological antecedents of authoritarian liberalism and its policy manifestations from Carl Schmitt's Political Economy of Governance. So I invite you to read that. Okay. Lastly, I would just like to comment that when we study the political economy of new authoritarianisms in Southeast Asia, there are three lessons to be learned based on my recent studies. One is that democratization can lead to either overcome or legitimize authoritarianism. The second is for all of us to never underestimate democratization nor overestimate authoritarianism and vice versa. Actually, one of those scholars who I admire also from this department before, Professor William Case, made a wrong prediction in Pacific Review when he argued that Najib was bulletproof. That was just that was the last paragraph in his article. I was just, yeah. So, yeah, and vice versa, overestimate and underestimate. The third is for us to also study, varieties of capitalism and the different liberalization processes in Southeast Asia. So my analytical note and methodological reminder for all of us to understand social phenomena in the Philippines, in Malaysia, or anywhere else in Southeast Asia is to have a good balance between understanding political contingency and historical specificities. So, salamat kasi.
Thanks very much, Juan. I'm sure we have 45 minutes left, so we have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you for a very comprehensive analysis of both countries, the phenomenon of authoritarianism. So I have two questions. One is about the Philippines and the other one is about Malaysia. So your analysis will hold valid if Bongbong Marcos becomes president. Does that change your analysis? In case, because there's a petition in the courts to invalidate the current vice president's victory, right? Robredo's victory. So in that case, he will become vice president, and Duterte already said publicly that if Marcos becomes vice president, he's so tired already of his drug war and the attacks on him, so he will resign. Anyway, so that's the first question. Is your analysis valid if Marcos returns? The one from Malaysia is what happens when Anwar becomes the prime minister? Is your analysis the same? Because you painted Mahathir's way of authoritarianism, but Anwar was, as you know, they fought head on. Is that the same outcome for Malaysia as you have painted for Malaysia to the time of Najib?
Yeah, of course, these are hypothetical questions that my answer would be it depends. Those possibilities would also require different analysis. First, in the Philippines, if Bongbong Marcos would become president, my analysis on the failure of the EDSA Republic would hold. And I blame actually the EDSA Republic for not putting an end to the Marcos family. As I said, key thing there would be that the Marcos family has remained wealthy. And that also applies to other elites or corrupt elites in Asia and Southeast Asia. They are still there. Those corrupt families, the families of dictators, is because they have remained wealthy. Yeah. As I mentioned in my presentation, that when you do political economy of understanding the elites in Southeast Asia, we see plutocracy in there. How economic wealth easily regenerates into political and social power. So if Bongbong Marcos would win or become president eventually, we still go back to this structural and historical argument, and then the way we understand political phenomenon in terms of path dependency. And that's what I did in the kind of analysis. Okay. There would be different contingencies there, but then we cannot deny the fact that has been established that the EDSA Republic has failed. Not totally failed, I did not use really the failure in my in the paper. What I used were shortcomings and hypocrisies of the liberal democratic EDSA Republic. Okay. And then the second one on what if Anwar. Actually, Anwar just won the by-election, so that's a step, an important step towards him becoming the next prime minister, if the internal agreement and deal would hold. Again, that's my answer. It's path dependency. We cannot remove the structures, institutions created by UMNO, Barisan National, in the last 60 years overnight. Okay? Actually, Mahathir was the one who hammered out the foundations of authoritarian neoliberalism. So right now, Mahathir is trying to redeem himself. He's denying all these labels against him, that he's dictator, that he now uses the word democracy. In his recent speech in the General Assembly of the United Nations, he was criticizing Aung San Suu Kyi. So if Mahathir, if Anwar becomes Prime Minister, and this is the same argument that I would say in the case of Mahathir right now, they may have addressed the authoritarian aspect, yeah, by pursuing more democracy, more democratic institutions, by being more open to civil society or opposition politics. But how about the other aspect that I mentioned, which is neoliberalism? And Anwar is a neoliberal guy. Anwar would push for neoliberalism, not anymore the Mahathir style, because Mahathir still believes in a strong state, a strong interventionist state in pursuing its neoliberalization process. So, but I don't want really to make predictions, but I was saying that I believe in doing path dependency and historical specificity in making all this analysis. But at the same time, as I mentioned in the beginning, my analysis would also allow for political contingencies, yeah, the accidents in history.
Juan, if I could just comment on the two papers together, but also comment on this issue of personalities. I mean, it's interesting because you're talking about authoritarian neoliberalism, although there are variations you're saying between them, but it's just starting in the Philippines after a 30-year hiatus, right? It's starting up again, as I understand the argument, after the EDSA regime period. And in the case of Malaysia, it seems to be just ending, right? Because we've had this transition, or at least it seems like Malaysia is moving toward a more more democratic system. So that's my first question is that your argument? Am I understanding that correctly? In other words, the comparison is sort of a different timing. So whereas the Philippines is moving towards authoritarianism and this authoritarian neoliberalism, Malaysia is moving away from it. So one is becoming authoritarian neoliberal, the other is moving away from it. In terms of the personalities, just to take up what this we were discussing, so this is the second time Anwar is supposed to succeed Mahathir. He was supposed to succeed Mahathir in the 90s, then he broke with Mahathir, put in jail, and now he's back, and they're allies again, and he's supposed to succeed him again. So there's history repeating itself, not yet as sparse, but it's repeating itself. And of course, the whole period, Mahathir has been a kind of kingmaker. He had gotten rid of Abdullah, and now he's gotten rid of Najib, right? So I think that's interesting in terms of personalities. And of course, the former dictator is now a supposed Democrat. So that's very interesting. And in terms of the Philippine case, I mean, you talk about the Marcoses, but we can equally talk about the Aquinos. And we had the president, Noynoy Aquino. We had his mother, Cory Aquino, and he had his father, Ninoy Aquino. There are all these sort of heroic figures, particularly the parents. And they were all quite popular. But you're arguing the EDSA regime was a failure. So I'm just curious how you explain how these figures, and Noynoy Aquino's popularity, as you know, was the highest of any post-Marcos president, and then EDSA failed.
Yeah, okay, in the beginning, actually on the first question, in the conclusion of my paper, I said that the present and the future are open-ended.
Sure.
Yeah, it's being fought over. So the Philippines is still a democracy. There's democratization processes going on. There's contestation. So the way we understand historical change is that you see that in terms of conflict. So for now, I just see it's more of a political contingency. Because the way that Duterte won is also based on accident. That's why I said that when in the beginning, when I highlighted the factors, the agential institution is structural. Okay, there are lots of analysis among political scientists on the structural reasons why Duterte won, but they have forgotten the essential, meaning that Duterte's team just came up with a better campaign strategy, and the campaign messaging connected well with the zeitgeist, Noynoy Aquino, when he won, the zeitgeist of the discourse at that time was good governance after Plan de Rossi years of Gloria Arroyo. But then, after Aquino, order and social change was just like the zeitgeist. So that's the agential factor. And the institutional, what if the Philippines had a parliamentary system, or we have political party discipline? The political fate of Duterte would have been different. I mentioned charisma because it's important in Philippine culture. But for me, I asked the question, why is charisma much more important for societies like the Philippines or in many Southeast Asia? But it has to do with the kind of institutions and social system that we have. Okay. So with regard to Anwar, I mentioned in the conference that somehow I was kind of scared of Anwar's preparation to become a prime minister. But we really cannot judge someone based on interviews. But maybe he's still suffering from some, he just came out of jail. So probably couldn't answer the questions well. But I had the impression that he is not yet prepared to be prime minister. The way that Mahathir would be more composed and mature in the way he would answer questions and the way he would govern Malaysia after Najib. And on the popularity of the Aquinos, I agree that they remain popular, but I think that it would be very difficult now for the liberals to come back to power. And that's why my call is that there should be a third force in the Philippines, the way I see it. Even in the kind of online debates between the Yellow Tars and the Dutertards, there's really a missing third force in that. But I agree that the Aquinos remain popular. They still have following. But I think the problem with Aquino, which was not mentioned in many analyses that I observed, was that for a long time, he has been beholden to the ambitions of Mar Rojas. When in fact surveys say that Mar Rojas wouldn't win. What if they decided that Grace Poe would be the president? Because the survey at that time was saying that Grace Poe would have won. So I also put part of the blame on Mar Rojas for bringing us in this kind of toxic discourse that we have. There's just so much hatred going on. But now Mar Rojas is relaxed and he's trying to get back to the Senate.
You mentioned this concept of the populist peace and that Duterte and Trump get along because they're kind of kindred spirits, because they're both populists. I mean, I guess first of all we should distinguish between right-wing and left-wing populists, because when Bernie Sanders wins in 2020 or Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, I don't think they're going to get along with Duterte that much. But do you think that there would have been an actual break then with the U.S. if Clinton won? I mean, Clinton did win, but if she actually became president, do you think that then there would have been a break and the Philippines would have moved closer towards China? Because in my understanding, I mean, I never believed that there would be a real break with the U.S. because there's deep integration between American capital and Philippine capital, and also the military too. I mean, it's not easy to suddenly buy Russian or Chinese military hardware because you have to change the whole command and control system, the interoperability, and all that stuff. So there seem to have been deep structural issues, no matter whether it was a right-wing populist or whatever, in coming to power in the U.S. So can you just explain a bit more what this idea of the populist peace?
Yep. This one is also the populist piece I cited in the paper about Trump. Why did he have different attitude towards Obama? Actually, Duterte did not choose between Trump and Hillary during the election. He waited for the election to finish, and he started attacking Obama when Obama was on his way out of power. So there was timing in that regard. But of course, he hated that Obama was criticizing Duterte or him. I agree with you on the structuralist analysis. Okay, and as we all know, the Philippines has an Americanized socialization. Okay? The military and police, they are very much in line or allied with the United States. The academics are also Americanized. The media are Americanized as well.
Fast food.
You can see the role of the United States during the Marawi crisis. How the armed forces and the police have continued their links with the U.S. Military and police force. That's how you see it. And Duterte is also aware in that regard. So that's a good reminder that it's this agent versus structure thing that is why I think that China knows that Duterte would also be short-term or fleeting. China's difference is that China can have long-term planning and thinking, but they are trying to get whatever they can now while Duterte is president. Okay, but they are not heavily invested in Duterte because they think that Duterte would just leave power in a few years' time. He won't be forever there. That's how great powers think. Yeah, I think I answered your question.
Yes, please.
Hi, Gwen. Actually, you partly answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway in case you want to further explain it. My first question is about the Duterte phenomenon as a protest vote. That's very powerful for me because, it's neither a rhetoric nor propaganda. It's a product of social, political, and historical processes. So that means that when the time comes that Duterte will die, and I think that's very, very soon, do you think this tradition of populism, authoritarianism will still pursue, or there will be a comeback of reformism or liberalism? Also, a hypothetical question. And my second question has something to do with your articles. I read some of the pages and very interesting, both articles. I wonder why, despite Mahathir being not in power since 2003, right? Still the prime ministers that came after him, still they use the agenda or the how do you call it, the wawasan 2020, right? Still they follow it. There's a continuity. The Malaysians in general, I think they value the importance of continuity. That I think is very different in the case of the Philippines, because in the Philippines, whenever there's a change in presidency, you'll expect that there is a change in everything, right? So I'm thinking about national processes here, societal dynamics perhaps. What is the difference between how the Malaysians think of development through change and the Philippines in terms of development through discontinuity?
Yes, I think the protest vote would continue. Even the strong supporters of Duterte, especially the OFWs, the overseas Filipino workers, many of them did not register actually to vote. Now they are much more inclined to register and vote, and they would remain an electoral force in the Philippines. But Duterte is a unique phenomenon in the Philippines. I can't imagine someone who, right now, who would replace him. To be a populist, there is this one lawyer, I don't want to mention his name, he's trying to make all these uncouth and vulgar words, but he's really not Duterte. They're trying to copy Duterte, but nobody can copy Duterte. But the kind of consciousness that the Filipinos have shown right now, that would continue for many, many more years. My worry has to do with the attack on democracy, the attack on human rights. And there's just so much hatred and groupthink mentality that's happening right now in the Philippines. And I don't see any healing happening anytime soon, especially in this social media. And about the comparison between the Philippine and the Malaysian development strategizing, when I was studying these two countries and reading all the development plans of the Philippines and Malaysia, I have realized how amateur or amateurish are the Filipino development planners as compared with Malaysian development planners. The Malaysian development planners really plan. They know how to design and plan an economy. So you're right, as I mentioned in the article, the Wawas in 2020 of Mahathir, it's just the foundation of Abdullah's Islam Hadhari and Najib's One Malaysia. So there's really continuity. But sometimes when you look at how they were implemented, and if you really know how bureaucracy works, maybe these are just the same people who have been doing the bureaucratic writing of all these plans and reports. But when you look at the discourse, and if you study development economics, the Malaysians, from Mahathir, Abdullah, and Najib, they speak that language academically. In the Philippines, our presidents don't speak like that, in an academic discourse and language. So if you listen to Mahathir, for instance, it's just like, Mahathir is an intellectual, Duterte is not an intellectual. He cannot even sustain an argument. Yeah, but you're right. There's a sense of continuity in Malaysia, and that's why I made an important distinction between a neoliberalization process pursued by Malaysia that has industrial policy, and the Philippines did not have industrial policy, and that made a lot of difference.
Yes, thank you very much. You used several times the terms authoritarian neoliberalism. What is that basically different from crony capitalism? And following from that question, if I understand your argument correctly, what you are saying is that the political conditions or the political situations in both Philippines and Malaysia is very much conditioned by the collision between the political elites and the business elites. Now that is very consistent with the Murdoch school of critical political economy, basically, which argues that the collusion between these two groups of elites will prevent any meaningful reforms to take place. And that seems to explain the development trajectory of these two countries as well. Now, if we assume these here are correct conditions, therefore, what difference will leader make in terms of the political transition?
Yeah. Okay, on authoritarian neoliberalism, again, I just published a more theoretical and conceptual paper on that. So, in the literature, there are two trends there. The first was that they see it as a violent response of the capitalist class to maintain capitalist hegemony and to also resolve the capitalist crisis. But the second one, the second thread, which I'm much more interested in, is that it is an ideological project of a section of the political and business elites to intellectually justify the embedding of neoliberal economy in an authoritarian, repressive political institution. Okay, and the way I see it, it is essentially capitalist in terms of processes of accumulation and the relations of production. Neoliberalism here, I just use it more as a specific phase in capitalist development, particularly signaling the end of the Keynesian development paradigm in the 70s and the 80s. Okay, and on your point about the Murdoch School and the political business alliances, you're right about Malaysia on that, and it's much more defined, and many have written about it already. In where would neoliberalism come in that, and which is I think it has to do with the role of global capital coming in. So the Murdoch School would usually do the state capital analysis, state capital relations. But under neoliberalism, you have to factor in another role, which is like global capital. So you don't anymore just have national government and the national bourgeoisies. What if global capital comes in? Okay, and you have to understand that dynamics. There are different tendencies. Okay, how would state capital relations deal with foreign capital? There are three ways, for instance. One would be just consent, let them come in. Okay. The other one would be coercion. Okay, if, like, say, Mahathir would say, I like this foreign capital to come in, and at the same time, he would have to discipline the national bourgeoisies to them. And then the other one would just be co-optation. Okay, so there are different ways on how you understand now the state capital relations, but factoring in the role of global capital under government, and that is what you have also observed under Najib, when Najib tried to put in Chinese capital and introduce that in the domestic accumulation regime of Malaysia. What Najib did, Najib actually went directly to the Chinese, and now we don't know how he would have played with the local Malaysian capitalists, because right now the local Malaysian capitalists are reacting against Chinese capital. So, and then the local capitalists got the support of Mahathir. So, I mean, there are no deterministic, I don't want to have a determinist kind of analysis in this dynamics. So, I would like to understand the specificities of the situation. And also to not forget the important role of agency as well, not just being so structuralist about
Well, I'm wondering, just a quick observation, I'm just curious if it has any impact on your analysis. Mahathir and Duterte are both nationalists. They're anti-colonial, anti-Western nationalists. I mean, Mahathir is so old. He's a contemporary of Sukarno, Nehru, and even Ho Chi Minh. I mean, this is one of the great figures of post-independent Southeast Asian nationalism. He's still in power, amazingly. And Duterte, although younger, though sicker probably than Mahathir, despite his being younger, in his early 70s. When he was a student, as you know, in the late 60s, he was a student of the now head of the Communist Party, Joe Maria Cizan, and was imbued with this kind of nationalism that was very predominant during the first quarter storm, this student activism period. And that still seems to have survived. Now, you talk about whether it's left or right-wing nationalism, but just, stick to the point that they're both nationalists. Does this have any impact on the two cases and in any case on your analysis? Because I think it's quite striking where, nationalism in the region seemed to be on the decline. Now we have these two countries led by people with strong nationalist credentials.
Okay. I see Mahathir as the original authoritarian populist. Okay. And the difference is that Mahathir even had an ethnic dimension in his populism. Okay. We don't have that in the Philippines. My argument was that Duterte was only nationalist during the election for the campaigns. Okay. If you look at his economic policies, very welcoming to foreign investors. If you look at his friendliness towards China right now and the way he's handling the South China Sea dispute, these are hardly nationalist.
But remember,
actions.
he said it's anti-Western. He said the Chinese are Asian, just like us.
Yeah, that's the Asian values argument. But I don't want to argue on Asian values when Mark Thompson is here. I just cited him in this concept. The way I see it is that Duterte was just nationalist during the election period. But even in terms of economic development before, he would talk about creating national champions. But he's not doing that anymore. He would like to invite a third player in the telecoms industry, most likely non-Filipino. So I only see Duterte as nationalist during campaign rhetoric and elections.
Oh, we do have more questions. So yes, maybe we can gather some questions. I thought we were out of questions, but we have 3 questions. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much.
Welcome, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
From the other side of Howard Tong. It's very fun.
Okay, thank you for giving us such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. First of all, I have to admit that I am a total stranger to Philippine politics. But anyway, I was in the Philippines 2 months ago attending the book fair. A tourism slogan that I saw, as far as I remember, is called "It's more fun in the Philippines." Right? It's more fun in the Philippines. But I think that tourism slogan could also be applied in understanding the political landscape of the Philippines. So my question actually is it seems to be the successive leaders of the Philippines, including the current president, Duterte, pronounce it correctly, Duterte. It seems like there's a tendency for them to confuse democracy with populism. Say if I got a chance reading one of his State of the Union address, right, when he was trying to defend his drug wars. Right? He said remarked something like, "Your concern is human rights, mine is human lives." So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what's your assessment of this kind of tendency for leaders to use democracy as a way, as a rubber stamp to validating their regimes? Are we going to see any change following the departure of President Duterte, or what's your observation and assessment?
Let me gather the questions as our time's running up. Shane?
Not really a question, but something to consider regarding the ethnic component. Because I personally think that Duterte has this ethnic component because he usually uses Mindanao. Not really an ethnic thing, but right? I mean, that's somehow similar to how Mahathir uses the Malay and so on.
Ruben?
Yeah, so I understand that for you, Duterte is an opportunist. He's an opportunist dictator, he's an opportunist nationalist. So he uses opportunity mainly for whatever goal he has. Now, I want to confirm whether I'm putting words into your mouth. So my other question is, you mentioned China. So the China is, its policy towards Duterte is for as long as Duterte is there, but he's going to live a short while only. So they try to get as much as they can. Is China's policy, in your view, the same as with Mahathir Anwar?
Okay.
More fun in the Philippines. Yeah, that's what populist movement would say, that they base their sentiments and arguments on majoritarian principle. Okay, so they say their argument is that the true, the correct, the right, the democratic is just based on the majority. Yeah, that's how they argue, bereft of any ethical and normative considerations. Okay. But of course, in the social sciences, we know that what is popular is not necessarily true, correct, democratic, or moral. On the ethnic dynamics, what we have, it's not really this ethnic issue as the one they have in Malaysia. We have provincial differences. The one with strong sentiments and towards Duterte would be the Visayas, yeah, and the Mindanaoans. And as an OFW myself, I could feel that, the Mindanaoans and then the Visayans, they are really passionate supporters of Duterte. There's something in that bond it's so difficult to break. Okay. On the opportunist, all politicians should be like that in order to survive. But I would just like to answer the Malaysia-China relations under Mahathir. So Mahathir is now the #1 opposition in Southeast Asia against Chinese hegemony. Okay, but he's not anti-Chinese capital. He would say that he would just like to be more selective in the investments. Okay? So he would like to have local content when China would invest. Like there should be Malaysian labor, there should be technology transfer. They don't want, Mahathir does not want what China is doing right now, that they invest heavily in real estate, what we call the brownfield in FDI. So he would like more on the greenfield FDIs. But you see there how state capacity and political will play in dealing with China. Mahathir is mature. He knows politics so well. He also knows geopolitics. And I think Malaysia has the state capacity to do that because, as I mentioned, it has attained a certain level of industrialization, that it can be selective in the kind of investment that that country would like to have in the country. The Philippines is not that selective. And many other countries in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Well, thank you for answering all those questions. Thank you for taking on 2 very complicated country cases. I think it's fair to say we all learned a tremendous amount, so thank you very much.
Yes.